was March 15th, 44 BC, and Julius Caesar had now conquered Pompey, his enemy, and he was now dictator of Rome. And Caesar was in the habit of doing all kinds of things that were offensive to the Roman Republic. The most notorious of which is he would have stationed wherever he went a golden throne, and he would sit around men that were supposed to be his equals on the throne, sometimes not even rising in their presence, and sitting like a lord or like an emperor. And so the conspiracy was to assassinate Julius Caesar on the Ides of March, just near the theater of Pompeii. And the aftermath of the assassination of Caesar was important for shaping the Roman world. The later stabilization under Augustus of the Roman Empire really rested on a foundation of the fact that it was an illusionary republic. The emperor, though by all accounts a lord, by all accounts the sovereign over all of the Roman Empire, and the Senate often in his pocket, or at least doing his bidding, still the Roman Empire for centuries after the establishment of the Augustinian Revolution rested always on the fact that they believed that the emperor was first among equals, that he was the princeps. And so we call this period of time from Caesar and Augustus all the way down until the 3rd century the Principate. Though the emperor is in many ways a lord, though he is an emperor, still the Senate and the aristocracy would fight him. They would check him on occasion. They would resist him, at least in terms of not doing his bidding or not simply following his rules at any whim. In the last lecture, though, we looked at the 3rd century crisis. We looked at the number of issues that convulsed the Roman Empire. And on the one hand, we talked about the failure of the Roman army in the early part of the 3rd century, and how the Roman army was unable to achieve ultimate victory and check the enemies out in Persia, the Sassanid Empire. And up in northern Europe, the Frankish and the Gothic armies were encroaching on Gaul, and the Roman army there was unable to defend itself in some ways, or at least to achieve a great deal of victory against their enemies. And so it became the age of the civil wars. It also became the age of persecution. And as the 3rd century drew to a close, what we see happening is the Roman Empire moves, as we say, from the Principate to the Dominate. And in this lecture, we're going to look at the rise of Diocletian. We're going to look at the Tetrarchy, which is the new attempt to establish Roman dominance as the empire. And we're going to look at the cult of the emperor as it arose, and the Dominate as the emperor moved from being first among equals, though of course always still the emperor, to the new style of imperial authority that focused on the emperor as lord and as somewhat equal to the gods themselves. And then lastly, we're going to look at the persecutions under the Diocletian regime and how they paved the way, ultimately, for the coming of Constantine and the conversion of the Roman world into the Christian world. The story of Diocletian is always told against the backdrop of the 3rd century crisis. And this is due to the fact that Diocletian restored the empire to a position of strength. Diocletian is the first emperor in almost 50 years to be able to last for any significant period of time. If you count up all of the emperors and all of the periods of time and the assassinations and the coups and all of the turmoil of the 3rd century, Diocletian's reign is really remarkable. He reigned for nearly 20 years. Meanwhile, during the civil wars, the average reign was somewhere between 1 or 2 years at the maximum. He had no significant rival during his time as emperor. And in fact, his period of time was a restabilization of both the economy, of the wealthy noble classes, and of the stability of old Rome as they knew it. Diocletian himself was not aristocracy. He was not from the normal senatorial ranks. In fact, his family was of low-class stock. But Diocletian made his name in the army, which, in the 3rd century, of course, is just the place you want to be in order to rise in rank. And so after the failure of a previous emperor to establish hegemony over Persia, Diocletian, as a result of his military prowess and as a result of his authority and his charisma amongst the armies, was proclaimed emperor on the 20th of November, 284. Now, perhaps because he was a military savant, Diocletian soon realized that the empire could not be governed by one single person, mainly due to the fact that one person could not keep control of two borders simultaneously by his own prowess. And so Diocletian embarked on a new idea, and this idea has been hailed as either stupidity, by a few, but by most, including historians, what Diocletian invents is seen as a brilliant strategy. Diocletian invents the idea of splitting the empire up into a tetrarchy, or a college of ruling emperors and sub-emperors, whose tasks are predominantly to keep the borders and the main imperial cities on solid ground. And the Tetrarchy just means the rule of four. That is to say that the empire would be ruled by four rulers, four men chosen from the army. First, Diocletian splits the east and the west between himself in the east and the west overseen by Maximianus. And Maximianus was a colleague of his. Maximianus had served with Diocletian out in the east during the Persian campaigns, and as a result, Diocletian promoted him to be co-emperor, as they called it, to be an Augustus with him. And just a few years after that, it was decided that they would appoint two sub-emperors, two emperors in training, if you will, and these emperors would be called Caesars. And so two men were appointed, again from military ranks, known for their prowess in battle and for their leadership skills. And in the east, it was Galerius. And Galerius was married actually to Diocletian's daughter. In the west, the Caesar was Constantius Chlorus. Constantius Chlorus was the father of Constantine, in fact. Constantius Chlorus had been married to Helena. Helena, of course, would later be beatified as Saint Helen or Saint Helena. However, when Constantius Chlorus takes the Caesar role of the West, he is forced to divorce Helena and marry Maximianus's stepdaughter. So you can kind of see what the ideal here is. Two Augustuses on either side, one in the east and one in the west, and two sub-emperors, two Caesars, who are loyal to the Augustuses by marriage, and they know then that the hereditary link between them and the succession to the next rank of Augustus was fixed. So the Tetrarchy really is brilliant on many levels. You have four generals, four leading rulers of the armies, so you don't have to worry about one of them rising up to declare himself to be emperor or assassinating the existing emperor. But you also have the two sides matched by marriage, so that there is a hereditary link between the two. The other piece that was brilliant to the Tetrarchy was the geographical range of the Tetrarchy. In the west, you had two main centers of imperial power. The Caesar, Constantius, took the city of Trier, and Trier is perfectly stationed to beat down both the Gothic barbarian tribes as well as to ensure that Gaul and Britain maintained loyalty to the empire. The Augustus in the west kept his palaces in Milan. Milan allowed the emperor there to keep an eye on what was happening in the southern Mediterranean world. And Rome at this time is suffering from the Berbers down in Africa who are frustrating the Roman armies in these regions, and so having an Augustus in this region proved valuable. In the east, you have Diocletian taking the area around the Bosporus. Now, this area would later become synonymous with Constantine, as he refounds what is later called New Rome or Constantinople, right on the same area. But Diocletian takes this region in particular because it is the wealthiest region, it is the seat of power, and it is also the area where the main Augustus, Diocletian, wants to keep an eye on the Persian East. The Caesar out in this region takes the city of Thessalonica. And so when you look at the map as a whole, you have all four of the Tetrarchy, the two Augustuses and the two Caesars, ruling across a geographical span that essentially comprised the Roman Empire. And so really the Tetrarchy is a brilliant invention. The four rulers issued edicts together. The four rulers were often depicted together, though of course everyone knew that Diocletian was the man in charge in many ways. And everyone assumed that the succession of the Tetrarchy was fixed. Because Diocletian and Maximianus had appointed Caesars who were also bound to them by marriage, to their daughter or stepdaughter, the process of the succession went quite smoothly. In fact, in 305, Diocletian decided that as his health was failing and as a sign of the stability of the Tetrarchy, Diocletian decided that he was going to step down. He also prevailed on Maximianus to step down. And so the two Augustuses in both the East and the West step down, and into their places rise the Caesars. Constantius Chlorus arises, moves up to the point of being Augustus in the West, and out in the East, Galerius is appointed Augustus. Now, it's at this point that the Tetrarchy begins to experience trouble. Galerius had a son. The son's name was Maxentius. And as we've seen, Constantius Chlorus' first son was Constantine with Helena. Now, both of these sons were passed over for the Caesarships. And that is going to be the thing that brings the Tetrarchy to its knees. For whatever reason, Galerius decided that he wanted to impose the Caesars of both the East and the West. In his own empire in the East, he appointed his nephew, Maximianus II, to be the Caesar, bypassing his son Maxentius. He also, in the West, required that Constantius Chlorus not appoint his son Constantine, but instead appoint his own man Severus to be the Caesar. And at least according to the army politics of the day, this was a big problem. The army did not like the fact that the great military sons of the great generals, who were now the Augustuses, were being passed over. This was an insult, and in fact, they did not wish to abide by Galerius's rules. And in fact, within a year, by 306, two major imperial armies had rebelled against the decision of Galerius to appoint Caesars that were not in the proper succession. And so, in 306, as Constantius Chlorus was up in Brittany attacking the Picts who were rebelling up in the north in what is modern-day Scotland, he died in 306 in the city of York, and the army immediately proclaimed Constantine to be the new Augustus. In the Roman regions, Maxentius is quickly proclaimed in 306 as well to be a rival imperial choice. As a result of this, the Tetrarchy eventually turned into another civil war. At one count, there were 6 rival breakup groups in both the East and the West, as different army toughs and as different generals were vying to be the next in line for either the Augustus or the Caesar. And in the West, the fight between Constantine and Maxentius would eventually come to a pitch, and Constantine would come to the throne and at the same time convert, which we will look at in the next lecture. Despite the failures of the Tetrarchy, though, we should not cast it aside as being irrelevant or being a bad idea. 20 years of the reign of Diocletian is certainly preferred to repeated assassinations and military civil wars. And just because the army returned to its old habits after 20 years is really more a sign of the impossibility of the army to be appeased than it is anything else. The Senate certainly wasn't going to keep them cowed, and the Tetrarchy at least had the opportunity to do this. Still, it was during Diocletian's reign that we actually see a number of changes in the way that the empire and the Roman identity began to shift and adapt. And this adaptation would have drastic consequences for Christians. Diocletian has been somewhat misunderstood by historians over the years. You really have a difference of opinion. Some see him as a progressive, as something of a liberal in many ways, at least politically speaking. The fact that he would take his empire and divide it up between 3 other men is certainly noble in many ways. At least it shows that he has a certain level of humility, or at least that's how we might see it in today's world. Other historians, though, have found Diocletian to be something of a conservative. They've pointed out the extent to which Diocletian focused on and expanded the traditional gods and the worship and the cultic practices of the traditional gods amongst the Roman pagan world. And really what's going on here, though, is a bit of both. Politically speaking, it's impossible to come up with 2 separate categories of either progressive liberal or reactionary conservative. Those two differences come to us down from the modern world, from the modern British world of the Whigs and the Tories, and all the way down to the U.S. Constitution and the constant two-party system that the American world has developed. Rather, with Diocletian, you have something of what I call the new conservatism. What happens with Diocletian is he is both conservative and yet also profoundly changing and shaping and progressively thinking about the ways of the Roman world. Take, for example, the worship of the gods. Diocletian, in some ways, looks very traditional. In fact, he looks more Roman than the Romans themselves in many ways. He is passionate. He is dogmatic. He's almost a Roman pagan fundamentalist in some ways, about the ways in which he wants his subjects to worship and venerate the gods and follow the practices and the pagan systems. Still, the way Diocletian alters and redirects those energies of pagan worship leads to some different applications. And this style of new conservatism, as I call it, actually happens pretty often in political history. You have someone rise in power, and they want to display their strength. They want to develop new concepts, usually about the cult of their own authority or their own seniority. And often what you see is they appeal back to some glorious, sort of foggy past, and they attempt to stoke up the energies of the national pride of the peoples. I mean, you can think of Hitler, for example, the way in which he clearly changed Germany to be a tool of his own will and of his own dominance. And yet repeatedly in his writings and in his speeches, Hitler leverages the landscape of the Germanic past as tools for enacting change. So he would appeal to the Teutonic myth, for example, or to the Aryan myth about German cultural and racial identity. And there are other countless examples of this throughout history, and Diocletian is one of them. Now, I'm not equating Diocletian to Hitler, though, of course, he is a dramatic and serious persecutor of Christianity. But still, what Diocletian is attempting to do is use the energies of the national pride of the Romans and of their sense of the foggy past, of how the Roman world used to be in the Golden Age. And he applies that to his age while also changing things. So it's at the same time new and conservative, hence the name, the new conservatism. And we see this best in the way that Diocletian and the other rulers styled themselves as equal with the gods. Now, as we said at the beginning of this lecture, the Roman Empire was always based on something of a figment of the fact that it was always a republic, that it remained a republic even though there was always an emperor or a dictator who ruled the republic with somewhat of an iron fist. Diocletian, when he comes to the throne, essentially overthrows all of those old concepts and those old ideas of the republic. The aristocracy under Diocletian becomes truncated in many ways. Diocletian doesn't even attempt to show the aristocracy that he sees himself as their equal or that they are in any ways his equal. He is divine, or at least a friend of the gods, favored by the gods, the one who in battle is given favor and miracles and all kinds of ways that he can defeat his enemies. The aristocracy is an annoying nuisance, and so Diocletian doesn't do away with the aristocracy or the senatorial classes, but he starts to appeal to them less and less and be far less concerned as to what their opinion really is. Similar shifts occur in the army. The army had always been subject to the Senate or subject to the people as a whole. The army did the bidding of the Senate, and occasionally the Senate would, of course, appoint a ruler, a dictator in, say, Caesar's case, to direct the armies more specifically. But under Diocletian and under the Tetrarchy, and this is carried on until the fall of the Roman Empire, the armies become directly subservient to the emperor. They are an extension of his own authority. And so in these and in many other ways, Diocletian ruled the secular world with an iron fist. He also specifically got involved with the reestablishment and the enforcement of the old pagan religion. We know that Diocletian and the other rulers with him spent large sums of money establishing pagan rites and worship, and in some cases, fixing or building temples to the gods. Diocletian himself was almost maniacal about observing the feast days and the sacrifices to the various gods. But again, this might seem simply conservative, but there is also an element that is new here. And the new thing that Diocletian enforces is how Diocletian relates to the divine presence of these gods on earth. Diocletian is always styled as not an equal with the gods, but a favored friend of the gods. Somewhat on the road to divinity. That's always sort of out there. That's a possibility for the Roman emperors. That if the gods see the emperor as particularly virtuous or as someone of significant stature, though as a human he can be elevated to the status of a god. This is what happens to Hercules, for example, at the end of his life in classic mythology. He becomes a god. But for the old pagan religion, the new focus of it was on the cultic relationship to the emperor. Now again, this is something historic. This was done in the past for the emperors. But the emperors would repeatedly push off any association that they were somehow to be worshipped or included as veneration. Diocletian doesn't have those qualms. He wants to be seen as superior, as above the fray of the hoi polloi, of the average common person, including the aristocracy. He is above them as well. And the way he enforces this is through traditional pagan worship. And therefore, because of this new conservatism, this renewed paganism that takes a new shift that is directed towards the emperor, Christians, again, come under persecution. And the Diocletian persecutions are considered to be the great persecutions. They are the worst, the most extensive, and they are the ones that last the longest. In the last lecture, of course, we noticed the Trajan-Decian persecutions as well as the Valerian persecutions. And both of those, while significantly painful for the church, actually didn't last very long. Both the emperors were either captured and killed, or the persecutions came to an end in a short period of time. Under Diocletian, though, the persecutions are global, they are permanent, and they last for over a decade. And Diocletian is particularly vicious about this. Seems very clear that Diocletian wants to not only persecute and destroy the Christians, but he knows that because the Christians are unwilling to sacrifice to the gods and that taking part in civic worship is actually to betray the faith, he actually takes steps to attempt to fracture the church, to divide it. There's one case after the persecutions have gone on for some time where Diocletian offers what he calls mercy, in which he appeals to the bishops and the priests who are in prison, and he says to them that if they just offer a small sacrifice, he'll let them return to their homes and no longer be tortured. You see in this that cruelty, that he knows that if he can get the leadership in particular to backslide, to cave in, to make an offer of sacrifice to a pagan god, that it will not only cause the Christians to have pain and feel as if they've lost something individually, but when they return to their churches, these leaders will now be discredited for having been released because they denied their Lord. It's uncertain what specifically set Diocletian off, though we do have from a couple of sources the story that as Diocletian was offering a sacrifice during one of the public holidays, in which all people were required to at least come and witness, that certain Christians made the sign of the cross as he slayed the animal during the sacrifice. And what happened is the sacrifice returned an ill omen, we are told. That is to say that the gods were seen as being unhappy, and then people put two and two together, that the Christians made the sign of the cross as this animal was sacrificed, and therefore they had angered the gods and brought down wrath on the entire area. Whatever the case, on February 23rd, 303, at the feast of the god Terminus, who is the god of the boundaries, the terminal limits, we might say, he was associated with the traditional gods of Rome, of Romulus in particular, who had defined the boundaries of the city of Rome herself. And so the god Terminus was considered to be very powerful and very important. And on this day, on this feast day, Diocletian issues an edict declaring that all Christians are to be persecuted. And what he's saying by this is that he has drawn a limit, that just as the god Terminus drew the limits of the city, now Diocletian has drawn the limits of what he will tolerate. And from this point on, Diocletian becomes a persecutor of all kinds of minority religions, not just Christians, but in particular Christians. He enacts a persecution, for example, of the Manichaeans. And the Manichaeans are a group that had developed a dualistic philosophy and theology based on their experience with Zoroastrianism. They're occasionally confused as a Christian heresy, but in fact they're another religion entirely. The Christians, though, took the brunt of the persecution. They were now afforded no legal rights whatsoever. They could not appeal their case to any legal court. They could be subject to torture. They could be subject to all kinds of penalties that would be withheld from Roman citizens. And again, all Christians are required to make sacrifice. All citizens, in fact, are required to make sacrifice. Across the vast majority of the Roman Empire, if not all of it, the Christians experienced the harshest persecutions that they would ever face since the time of the apostles. And this new emperor, this Diocletian, this man who styled himself to be a friend of the gods, was somewhat cruel in his persecution of the followers of Christ. So violent were these persecutions that the earlier rumblings under Decius and under Valerian now reached their full potential. The Donatists, for example, in North Africa, and other break-off groups, hardliners who felt that the Christians had backslid, or that their faith was now voided, or even that they needed to be rebaptized. All of these issues became prevalent in the church. The Diocletian Revolution seemed to never end. It was over 10 years. Edict after edict issued new commands that the church was supposed to follow, that additional pressures were to be placed on the church to either break it up, to cause them to separate, to lose freedoms, to be reduced to slavery if possible, and that churches were to be burned to the ground, and that scriptures would be burned to the ground. And so as we get to the end of the Diocletian Revolution, it really is almost impossible to assume that within just a couple of years, the Christian world would be back on its feet, and that the emperor himself would not be persecuting the church, but would be expressing his own personal faith for Christ, and that he would be expansively extending rights and privileges and comfort and help and aid to the church. And of course, we're talking about Constantine. As we go into the next lecture, we're going to take a look at Constantine's conversion, and we're going to look at his role in changing the church. But we need to acknowledge now that from the vantage point of the Christians who were on the ground under Diocletian, it is almost impossible to believe that someone who would be a Christ follower would follow Diocletian as the ruler of Rome. Just a few years after Constantine comes to the throne, in fact, there is the Council of Nicaea, which we'll look at in the next lecture. But now we can point out the fact that the bishops who attended Nicaea, many of them had suffered persecution. We have to understand that the 330 bishops who were there, a number of them perhaps bore scars, that they had physical infirmities from the tortures, that they had lost livelihoods and been put under severest pressure, and that if they themselves had stood tall, that people in their churches had suffered the unfortunate result of having to deny one's faith under the pain of torture, and then maybe try to seek their way back to the forgiveness of the church and of Christ. And so as we look to the next step, to Constantine coming to the throne, and the Christian world being back on its feet, we have to recognize that the Diocletian Revolution brought with it the Diocletian persecution, the great persecutions. And those persecutions were the last great persecutions that the Christians in the West would ever experience.